What's gaming, gamers? Today I've got a Hunter Prismatic build for you that genuinely does it all. This build has everything you could ask for: survivability, boss damage, crowd control, even a dash of distracting enemies such that even when you're solo, nothing is shooting at you. How can that all be possible, you ask? Well, watch the video to find out. Before I get into the video, however, I'd like to shout out our clan, the Tyrant Seraphs. If you're looking for people to play any content in Destiny with, ranging from ritual playlist and seasonal activities all the way to raids and Grandmaster strikes, feel free to join the Discord server. We welcome anyone, no matter how new or seasoned you are, and all of us will teach encounters if you don't know something. If you're interested, hop into the Discord server and play some Destiny with us, the link is in the description. Now, for the build itself, I'll start with a prescriptive build guide in case that's what you're looking for. Once I've done that, I'll go into detail about what each element of the build does, why I've chosen them, as well as any alternative options and their pros and cons, should there be any. For the prescriptive build setup, firstly, use the Liar's Handshake exotic arms armor. For your prismatic subclass, use the Strand Silkstrike Super, the Gambler's Dodge, whichever jump you prefer, the Arc Combination Blow melee ability, the Strand Grapple Grenade, the Strand Threaded Spectre aspect, the Stasis Winter's Shroud aspect, Facet of Courage, Facet of Dawn, Facet of Devotion, Facet of Protection, Facet of Purpose, and Facet of Sacrifice. For the Episode Revenant artifact, use the Brain Freeze mod and the Conductive Cosmic Crystal mod. For Episode Revenant tonics, use either the Potent or Refined Tonic of Renewing finishers. For armor stat distribution, I have 30 mobility, 101 resilience, 62 recovery, 106 discipline, 32 intellect, and 60 strength. For the armor's mod setup, on your helmet, run 2 hands-on mods and 1 harmonic siphon mod. On your arms, run 3 heavy-handed mods. On your chest piece, run 1 arc, 1 solar, and 1 void resistance mod. On your legs, run 1 Better Already mod, 1 Innervation mod, and 1 Recuperation mod. On your cloak, run 1 Bomber mod, 1 1-2 Finisher mod, and 1 Powerful Attraction mod. For weapons, in your kinetic slot, run the Swordbreaker Strand Shotgun from the Crotus End raid with the perk combination of Pugilist and 1-2 Punch. In your energy slot, run the Sunshot Exotic Solar Hand Cannon. In your heavy slot, run the Edge Transit Void Grenade Launcher from the classic Onslaught activity with the perk combination of Bait and Switch and Envious Assassin. With the entire prescriptive build setup now detailed, I'll get into describing the entire build, starting with the Liar's Handshake exotic arms armor. Liar's Handshake has the exotic perk Cross Counter, which will grant you the Cross Counter buff for 3 seconds after having either dealt or received melee damage. Cross Counter grants your next melee attack 200% increased damage, and the buff is consumed instantly upon dealing damage with said melee attack. The Cross Counter melee attack itself deals arc damage, which means it will charge your light transcendence energy even if you don't use a powered melee attack for the Cross Counter hit itself. Lastly, upon dealing damage with your Cross Counter melee attack, you'll be healed a small amount, which will help your survivability significantly. Now that you know what Liar's Handshake does, I'll get into the subclass setup designed for use with Liar's Handshake. The Strand Silkstrike Super is a roaming super wherein you weave a rope dart which you wield to kill enemies. Using Silkstrike's light attack will send the rope dart forwards, dealing damage to enemies and draining 4% of your super's energy. If the light attack kills an enemy, that enemy will explode, dealing damage to enemies in a radius around the explosion. Silkstrike's heavy attack will swing the rope dart around you in a circle, damaging any enemy within that circle's radius at the cost of 9% super energy. The heavy attack will damage enemies twice, but still does less damage to single targets than the light attack does, so only use it on groups of enemies. Furthermore, while in your Silkstrike Super, you'll have a 90% resistance to all incoming damage for the super's duration, making it a very useful panic button if you find yourself needing to escape a dangerous situation. However, the reason Silkstrike is chosen over any of the other supers isn't for the fact that it's Silkstrike, but that it's Strand. Silkstrike being Strand grants this build the ability to proc Woven Mail constantly via the Facet of Purpose fragment. I'll talk more about Facet of Purpose specifically when I go over the fragments shortly, but having access to Woven Mail's 45% damage resistance nearly constantly is of significant help to this build, scaling to higher difficulty activities. Onto your dodge, the Gambler's Dodge, when cast within 15 meters of any enemy, will instantly grant you a fixed 130% melee ability energy, effectively fully refunding your melee ability. This is imperative to this build's melee dodge combat loop, and as such, the Gambler's Dodge cannot be substituted for either the Acrobat's or Marksman's Dodge. For your melee ability, the Combination Blow melee ability will, upon getting a kill, instantly grant you a fixed 100% class ability energy, heal you a small amount, and grant you 1 stack of the Combination Blow buff for 20 seconds. Combination Blow can stack up to 3 times, with each stack of the buff granting significantly increased melee damage. With 1 stack, your powered melee will deal 60% increased damage. 2 stacks increase that buff to 156%, And 3 stacks of Combination Blow will see your powered melee attacks deal 309% increased damage. These damage increases are combined with Cross Counter's 200% increase, making for a remarkable melee damage increase. Furthermore, the healing granted by Combination Blow's attack is also combined with Cross Counter's heal when it gets a hit. This makes it even safer to use against enemies that won't die to a single melee hit, as you'll be healed regardless of whether they die or not. Onto the grenade, the grapple grenade is chosen for a couple of reasons. Firstly, the grapple grenade will help you to close the distance between yourself and enemies outside of your melee range quickly, without having to swap to something like an eager edge sword. As this build requires being within melee distance of enemies, having a free, near instant way to close the distance between yourself and enemies is imperative. Additionally, the grapple grenade will grant you access to the Unraveled debuff via the grapple melee, which will come in handy when combined with the Facet of Courage fragment later on. Lastly, the grapple grenade itself and the grapple melee will both serve to grant you Darkness Transcendence energy, which will be beneficial for going Transcendent more often. Onto the aspects, firstly, Threaded Spectre will cause a Strand decoy to be summoned upon the use of your class ability. The decoy itself will last 12 seconds, and upon being destroyed by either yourself or enemies will explode, dealing damage in a small area. Furthermore, when enemies get within a short distance of the Threaded Spectre's decoy, it will also explode. When the decoy explodes due to an enemy's proximity, it will summon 2 Threadlings along with the explosion. These Threadlings are only summoned via a proximity detonation, however. If the decoy is destroyed by damage from any source, it won't summon Threadlings. While the Threaded Spectre aspect is equipped, your class ability will passively recharge 40% slower, but this isn't an issue with this build, as you'll be actively refunding your Gambler's Dodge using the Combination Blow melee ability. Threaded Spectre is very helpful for solo content especially, as one decoy is summoned every single time you use your dodge ability. Each decoy will serve to distract enemies, which helps prevent them from shooting at you. This, in turn, increases your survivability greatly. Furthermore, every time a decoy explodes and damages an enemy, you'll be granted Darkness Transcendence energy, which will be helpful as this build deals mostly light damage. The second aspect, Winter's Shroud, will cause the use of your class ability to apply 60 slow stacks to any enemy within 9 meters of you for 8 seconds. Furthermore, upon applying the slow debuff to an enemy, your class ability will be granted a 300% increase to its passive recharge rate for 3 seconds. Winter's Shroud is brought for 2 main reasons. The first is the application of the slow debuff, and the second is the 3 fragment slots the aspect grants. Winter's Shroud applying slow to enemies means enemies will almost constantly have a darkness debuff applied to them, which will allow you to proc not only a few artifact mods, but also the Facet of Courage fragment. I'll talk more about those interactions when I get to describing the fragments and artifact. Next, the 3 fragment slots for Winter's Shroud will grant this build much more build crafting potential. This build takes significant advantage of all 6 fragment slots it has access to, making Winter's Shroud all the more appealing of an aspect to equip. Now that you know what the aspects do and why they're chosen, I'll get into the 6 prescriptive fragments to use with this build. Firstly, Facet of Courage will cause light damage abilities to deal 10% more damage to enemies afflicted with any darkness debuff. Darkness debuffs include Stasis Slow and Freeze, as well as Strand Sever, Suspend, and Unravel. This build will be able to apply Stasis Slow and Freeze by dodging near enemies via the Winter's Shroud aspect, and will be able to apply the Unravel debuff by using the Grapple melee ability. Both the Combination Blow melee ability and Liar's Handshake's Cross Counter melee ability are light damage abilities, meaning they'll deal 10% more damage to any enemy afflicted with a darkness debuff. Having this 10% damage boost applied almost constantly will be of great help for this build, especially when dealing damage to champions, mini-bosses, and bosses. Facet of Courage also increases your Discipline stat by 10 points, which will help your Grapple Grenade passively recharge faster. The second fragment, Facet of Dawn, will grant you the Radiant buff for 5 seconds every time you damage an enemy with your powered melee attack. Furthermore, if your powered melee attack gets a kill, both yourself and nearby allies will receive the same Radiant buff for 5 seconds. The Radiant buff can't be increased past this 5-second duration, but it can be refreshed to 5 seconds so long as you continue to get hits and kills with your powered melee attack. The Radiant buff itself will grant all of your weapons a 25% boost to their outgoing damage, as well as allowing them to pierce barrier shields if they don't already have another anti-champion mod applied to them. As much as this build won't be using weapons all too often, it does help significantly with your weapon damage when you do use them. However, the biggest reason Facet of Dawn is brought is for its interaction with Facet of Sacrifice. I'll talk more about Facet of Sacrifice shortly, but the main thing to remember is that Facet of Dawn grants Radiant, which is a light buff. Lastly, Facet of Dawn does come with a 10-point deficit to your strength stat, but this is entirely unimportant for this build, as it'll be recharging the melee ability actively via the Gambler's Dodge instead of passively via the strength stat. Third, for fragments, the Facet of Devotion fragment will cause the killing of enemies afflicted with any darkness debuff to grant extra light transcendence energy. Rank and file enemies will grant an increased 1% light transcendence energy, elites will grant an increased 3%, and any enemy classified as a mini-boss or above will grant an extra 5% light transcendence energy. As this build will be killing enemies affected with darkness debuffs nearly constantly, you'll effectively be receiving this extra light transcendence energy every single time you get a kill. This will increase your transcendence uptime significantly, which will help your survivability immensely. Facet of Devotion also comes with a 10-point boost to your strength stat, but this is negligible as, again, this build will be recharging the melee ability actively via the Gambler's Dodge instead of passively via the strength stat. The fourth fragment to bring is Facet of Protection. Facet of Protection will grant you 15% increased damage resistance to all incoming damage while within 15 meters of 3 or more enemies. Furthermore, Facet of Protection's damage resistance stacks with Transcendence's 20% intrinsic damage resistance, combining for an overall 32% damage resistance while both Facet of Protection and Transcendence are active. Facet of Protection's increased damage resistance will help noticeably with your survivability when amongst group of adds while you're chaining melee attacks. As this build is a melee build, it'll constantly benefit from Facet of Protection's damage resistance, allowing this build markedly more survivability than it would have otherwise. Similarly to Facet of Devotion, Facet of Protection comes with a 10-point boost to your strength stat, however this again is negligible. Fifth, for Fragments, the Facet of Purpose fragment will cause the collection of any orb of power to grant you a super element matching buff with no cooldown. In this build's case, as it uses the Silk Strike super, the collection of orbs of power will grant you the Woven Mail buff for 5 seconds. Woven Mail will itself grant you a 45% resistance to all incoming damage while it's active, which stacks multiplicatively with all other sources of damage resistance. While you have Woven Mail, Facet of Protection, and Transcendence active, you'll have a 62% increase to your overall damage resistance, significantly increasing your survivability in all content in the game. Facet of Purpose does come with a 10-point deficit to your recovery stat. Fortunately, this build will be healing actively more often than passively, so this shouldn't be too big of a deal to your overall health regeneration. The sixth and final fragment to bring is Facet of Sacrifice. Facet of Sacrifice will cause every ability kill you get while you have any light element buff to grant you an additional 1% Darkness Transcendence energy. Because this build takes advantage of the Facet of Dawn fragment, every powered melee hit and kill you get will grant you the Radiant buff. This is a light element buff, meaning Facet of Sacrifice will proc every single time you get a powered melee kill. This causes your Darkness Transcendence energy to build significantly faster than it normally would, granting you noticeably increased Transcendence uptime. Furthermore, Facet of Sacrifice also comes with a 10-point boost to your Discipline stat, which will slightly increase your Grapple Grenade's passive recharge rate. With the subclasses set up now detailed, I'll get into the artifact mods to run if you're watching this video during Act 1 of episode Revenant. Firstly, the Brain Freeze mod will cause frozen enemies to project a slowing fog around them that applies slow stacks to enemies that don't already have a stasis debuff applied to them. This build can freeze enemies incredibly easily via the Winter's Shroud aspect. Your Gambler's Dodge will apply 60 slow stacks to nearby enemies, which will freeze any enemy you dodge twice next to. Then, that frozen enemy will have Brain Freeze's slowing fog projected around them, slowing enemies nearby that may have been out of the range of your Winter's Shroud dodges. Brain Freeze will help you to proc both the Facet of Courage and Facet of Devotion fragments more often, as it'll cause more enemies to be afflicted with a stasis debuff. When you kill a frozen target, that target will shatter, and especially in low to mid difficulty content, that shatter will kill nearby enemies. Brain Freeze causes those nearby enemies to have a stasis debuff applied to them, which means if and when they die to the shatter damage, they'll still grant you Facet of Devotion's extra light Transcendence energy. The only other artifact mod you should bring is Conductive Cosmic Crystal. Conductive Cosmic Crystal will cause your Arc and Void abilities, as well as any weapons you have equipped with the Dark Aether Reaper origin trait, to deal 5% increased damage to enemies afflicted with stasis debuffs. This is a fantastic artifact mod for this build, as it'll be applying stasis debuffs to nearly every enemy you come in contact with. Furthermore, this build's main source of damage is an Arc ability, granting you this damage increase on nearly every enemy you'll be attacking. As for the episode Revenant tonic to run with this build, either the potent or refined tonic of renewing finishers should be chosen for its buff to the Conductive Cosmic Crystal artifact mod. When you have either of these tonics active, they'll cause the damage buff granted by Conductive Cosmic Crystal against enemies affected by stasis debuffs to be increased. Your Arc and Void abilities will deal 8% increased damage instead of 5%, and your Dark Aether Reaper weapons will deal 10% increased damage instead of 5%. This will simply further increase your combination blow and cross counters damage, allowing you to deal with enemies slightly faster overall. The effect is most noticeable in higher difficulty content as enemies have more health, so you don't have to worry too much about activating the tonic if you're playing in lower difficulty ritual playlist activities. With the episode Revenant episodic mechanics now detailed, I'll begin detailing the armor's setup, starting with stat distribution. In the top 3 stat grouping of Mobility, Resilience, and Recovery, prioritize Resilience first, Recovery second, and Mobility third. Resilience will be by far the most important stat to spec into for this build. Every tier of Resilience you have will slightly increase your total amount of health, as well as increasing your base overall damage resistance to all incoming damage. At tier 10 Resilience, you'll have a maximum of 200 health and a significant 30% resistance to all incoming damage. As such, prioritize getting Resilience to tier 10 above all other stats. The damage resistance is too important to ignore. Recovery is the second most important stat in the top 3 grouping, as it dictates both the delay between your health regenerating as well as the rate at which your health regenerates. This build will be actively healing more often than not, but having a respectable recovery stat will help immensely if you can't close the distance between yourself and enemies to actively heal yourself. Furthermore, as recovery will affect the rate at which you regenerate health, higher recovery stat values will positively affect the better already mod on your legs. Mobility is the least important stat to spec into in the top 3 stat grouping, and I wouldn't recommend having any higher than 30 points in mobility. This build will be actively regenerating the combination blow melee ability often with this setup, so even if you miss your Gambler's Dodge and don't refund your melee ability, you won't have to wait for Gambler's Dodge to passively recharge to get your melee back. As that's the case, don't spec into mobility and save your stat tiers for a better, more useful stat. In the bottom 3 stat grouping of Discipline, Intellect, and Strength, spec into Discipline first, with Strength second, and Intellect third. Discipline is the most important stat to spec into in the bottom 3 stat grouping, as the higher your Discipline stat is, the faster your grenade will passively recharge. All forms of active grenade regeneration are percentage based, which won't be affected by Discipline at all, but having Discipline as high as you can get it will significantly increase your grenade's recharge rate when you don't have any way to actively regenerate it. Strength is the second most important stat to spec into, but it's not entirely an important stat to spec into. This build will be actively regenerating your melee ability often, but having a few points in strength will supplement the active regeneration with slightly faster passive regeneration, helping its uptime if you miss your Gambler's Dodge. Intellect is entirely unimportant for this build, simply don't put any more than 30 points into it. All Intellect does is decrease your super's base cooldown, which isn't at all important for this build. Save your stat points for other, more important stats. With Armor stat distribution now detailed, I'll get into the Armor's mod setup for this build. On your helmet, the 2 hands-on mods will work together to grant you additional super energy every time you get a melee kill. These will simply increase your Silk Strike's uptime, allowing you to use it effectively whenever you want. Next, the Harmonic Siphon mod will cause rapid strand weapon final blows to generate an orb of power. Admittedly, Harmonic Siphon will see next to no use. I only use it when I miss my Gambler's Dodge and need to regenerate my melee ability using my Swordbreaker Strand Shotgun's Pugilist perk. I find that the Harmonic Siphon is only really used when I'm in a group. I almost never need to use it when playing solo, as the enemies near me when I need to use my Gambler's Dodge usually don't get killed before I use it. Onto your arms, the 3 heavy-handed mods together will generate a very potent orb of power upon getting a powered melee kill with a 1-second cooldown between orb generations. The potency of the orb of power only matters for super energy gains, which isn't really that important, but with multiple heavy-handed mods equipped, the cooldown between orb generations is lowered. If you were to only have 2 heavy-handed mods equipped, there would be a 5-second cooldown between orb generations. As the Facet of Purpose Fragment will grant you Woven Mail for 5 seconds upon the collection of an Orb of Power, you can get away with only running 2 heavy-handed mods. However, if you do run only 2, you will have slight Woven Mail downtime, which can adversely affect survivability. Additionally, you won't be granted healing via the Recuperation or Better Already mods as frequently, which will also adversely affect your survivability. Overall, running 3 heavy-handed mods is overwhelmingly recommended, but running 2 of them can work in low to mid difficulty content. For your chest piece, simply running whatever resistance mods you need for the content you'll be running will suffice. For general low-level content, I usually just run 1 Arc, 1 Solar, and 1 Void resistance mod, but when running higher difficulty content or any content with a threat modifier, I will change my resistance mods accordingly. In higher difficulty content, it's smart to think of what enemy type you'll be fighting against, as they generally have 1 or 2 main sources of damage. A good example is the Vex. Vex have significant void damage sources such as the Laser Harpies, Major Goblins, Minotaurs, Wyverns, Cyclopses, and Hydras. As that's the case, when going into an activity wherein you'll be fighting Vex, bring 2 void resistances and 1 of a separate damage type. If there will be champions, I usually bring a solar resistance, as the barrier champion Hobgoblin Snipers deal large bursts of solar damage. The same goes for threat modifiers. Run 2 resistance mods that correspond with the activity's threat modifier, and run 1 separate resistance mod of a damage type you know you'll be subject to. Onto your legs, firstly, the Better Already mod will cause your health to instantly start regenerating upon the collection of any Orb of Power. This health regeneration can be interrupted if you take damage, as it's just normal health regeneration, but it will serve to increase the effective health you gain from each individual orb of power. Next, the Innervation mod by itself will grant your grapple grenade 9% of its energy instantly upon collecting any orb of power with no cooldown. This will help you have your grapple grenade active significantly more often, allowing you to take advantage of its repositioning, darkness damage, and its application of the Unravel debuff more often. Lastly, for your legs mods, the Recuperation mod will grant you 70 health instantly upon the collection of any orb of power with no cooldown. This will help immensely with your survivability. The cross counter and combination blow healing just isn't enough on its own in higher difficulty content, and especially not when solo. Furthermore, with 3 heavy-handed mods equipped, you'll generate 1 orb of power every time you get a kill with your cross counter or combination blow, meaning you'll get access to the 70 health every kill. And it'll stack with the Better Already mod, meaning each orb of power will heal you for 70 health plus however much health you can regenerate before you take damage again. These 2 mods simply make orbs of power your main source of survivability, and with this build's proficiency in generating them, you'll be plenty survivable. As for your cloaks mods, firstly, the Bomber mod will grant you 7.2% grenade ability energy upon the use of your class ability with no cooldown. This is in addition to Innervation's grenade energy gains, and as getting a melee kill both summons an orb of power and refunds your class ability, you'll effectively be gaining 16.2% grenade ability energy for every powered melee kill you get. Next, the 1-2 finisher mod will grant you 70% powered melee energy upon using your finisher on an enemy, so long as you have 3 stacks of armor charge when you do so. This mod is incredibly useful for this build, as it's very possible to miss your gambler's dodge, especially when playing in a group. If you do, having 1-2 finisher ready will almost always get you right back into continuing your melee dodge loop. 1-2 finisher is another reason why 3 heavy-handed mods is incredibly useful for this build. With 3 heavy-handed mods, it'll take you around 3 or 4 seconds to get up to 3 stacks of armor charge, which will allow 1-2 finisher to work more often. If you only have 2 heavy-handed mods, you'll need at least 15 seconds to collect 3 orbs of power via melee kills, which significantly decreases your margin for error when using your gambler's dodge. Lastly, for your cloaks mods, the Powerful Attraction mod will cause any orbs of power within 12.5 meters of you to be instantly collected upon the use of your class ability. This effectively ensures you'll collect the orb of power generated by heavy-handed when you get a melee kill, as they tend to kind of pop up in the air after you get a kill, making them awkward to collect manually. This in turn ensures you're granted super energy, armor charge, grenade ability energy via Innervation, and health via Better Already and Recuperation, all with consistency. With the Armor's mod setup now entirely detailed, I'll get into my recommendations for weapon choice for this build. I'll first go over my prescriptive setup for specific weapons, and while I'm doing that, I'll give more generalized recommendations that should suit players who don't have specific weapons, specific roles, or just don't like using a certain type of weapon. For your kinetic slot, I use the Swordbreaker Strand Shotgun from the Crota's End Raid with the perk combination of 1-2 Punch and Pugilist. Having Swordbreaker with this specific role does 3 things for this build. Firstly, Swordbreaker is Strand, meaning it'll grant Darkness Transcendence energy whenever you deal damage or get kills with it. Second, the 1-2 Punch weapon perk will allow your next combination blow melee attack to deal 150% increased damage whenever you hit all 12 pellets in a single shot. Lastly, Pugilist on a shotgun will grant you 20% combination blow energy every single time you get a kill with that shotgun. All of these things mean, with this roll on Swordbreaker, you'll be able to increase your melee's damage significantly, and refund your melee's energy if you miss your gambler's dodge, all while granting you Darkness Transcendence energy. While I do highly recommend this roll on this gun, I do also concede that it's a raid weapon, and not everybody has access to raids or fire teams with which to raid. Unfortunately, the only other darkness damage shotgun that can roll 1-2 punch is the Deadlock Stasis shotgun from the Crucible competitive playlist, and Deadlock can't roll Pugilist, meaning you'd have to forego the melee ability regeneration in favor of Transcendence energy. There are kinetic shotguns that can roll 1-2 punch and Pugilist, but they'll be less effective at generating Darkness Transcendence energy. The easiest ones to get would be the Perfect Paradox kinetic shotgun from episode Echoes, and the Wastelander M5 kinetic shotgun from Dares of Eternity. For your energy slot, I usually use the Sunshot Solar Exotic Hand Cannon, but you can really run whatever gun you want here. If I find myself needing to stun a specific type of champion, I usually just equip a weapon for that purpose. I don't have anything else to say about the energy weapon because this build really won't be using it almost ever. Just use whatever you want to or whatever you need for the activity you'll be playing. Onto your power slot, during episode Revenant, I recommend the Edge Transit Void Grenade Launcher from the classic Onslaught activity with the perk combination of Bait and Switch and Envious Assassin. However, it doesn't have to be Edge Transit specifically. Any DPS rolled grenade launcher will work in this slot. Perks like Bait and Switch, Explosive Light, Frenzy, and to a lesser extent Vorpal Weapon will all work well when applied on a heavy GL. As for specific GLs that can roll these perks as an alternative to Edge Transit, there are the A Cosmic Void Grenade Launcher from the Festival of the Lost event, the Bittersweet Arc Grenade Launcher from episode Revenant, the Corax's Distress Strand Grenade Launcher from the Root of Nightmares raid, the Marzilian Sea Solar Grenade Launcher from the World Drop Weapon Pool, the Typhon GL5 Stasis Grenade Launcher from the World Drop Weapon Pool, and the Wicked Sister Strand Grenade Launcher from the Vanguard Weapon Pool. With the entire build now detailed, I can tell you a few tips and tricks I have for use with this build. Firstly, when entering an engagement, look for the lowest health enemies first. You want to kill enemies like Scions, Dregs, Thrall, and Acolytes first, as they'll help you to build up your combination blow stacks. Once you're at 3 stacks of combination blow, you can start to take out higher health mages and elites with ease. If you're running a 1-2 punch shotgun, which you should be, proc 1-2 punch before your combination blow melee to increase its damage. But be careful not to use it before your cross counter melee, as 1-2 punch will lower the cross counter attack's total damage. Use your dodge nearby mages and elites to apply the slow debuff to them, causing your melee to deal more damage to them thanks to the Facet of Courage fragment and the Conductive Cosmic Crystal artifact mod. Alternatively, use your grapple melee to apply the Unravel debuff, which will also proc Facet of Courage to grant your combination blow and cross counter increased damage. To stay alive more consistently, have 100 resilience to max out your base damage resistance. Then, be near enemies to proc Facet of Protection, collect Orbs of Power to proc Woven Mail via Facet of Purpose, and use Transcendence to be granted its damage resistance. To heal yourself, use Combination Blow and Cross Counter melee attacks, and collect Orbs of Power to proc the Better Already and Recuperation armor mods. Lastly, if you miss your Gambler's Dodge, simply use your finisher on an enemy to refund most of your Combination Blow, and use your Pugilist Shotgun to fill the rest of its energy. But that's all for this video. Thank you for watching. If you have any questions, comments, or constructive criticisms, please leave them in the comments. I read all of them and reply to all that I can. If you'd like to see more content like this in the future, consider subscribing. Lastly, if you'd like to join our clan, the Tyrant Seraphs, or simply play some Destiny with us, you can learn more about that by joining our Discord server. The link is in the description. Again, thank you for watching and have a great day.